It started as just another day in the sky, passengers settling into their seats, the hum of the engines growing louder. But for one man, this flight was about to take an unexpected turn. As he walked into the first-class cabin, dressed in understated elegance, the flight attendant stopped him. Her tone was sharp, her expression dismissive. "This section is for first-class passengers only," she said, blocking his path. The man calmly explained that he was in the right place, handing over his ticket. But her skepticism only deepened. She questioned his presence, making it clear she didn't think he belonged. What she didn't know was that this wasn't just any passenger, and this wasn't just any plane. As tensions rose, passengers began to take notice, whispers rippling through the cabin. Little did she realize, her actions were about to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. The man, dressed in a plain grey hoodie and jeans, looked almost invisible in the sea of well-dressed passengers around him. But something about his calm demeanor set him apart. The flight attendant's skepticism was palpable, and she made no effort to hide her disdain. "I'm afraid you'll need to move," she insisted, her voice colder now. The other passengers began to watch, sensing something wasn't right. Whispers spread. Some seemed uncomfortable, others curious. Was this a mistake? Or was it something more? The flight attendant, still unmoved, gestured to the door, urging him to leave first class. But the man didn't budge. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small black card that gleamed under the cabin lights. It was a private, exclusive card, one that only a handful of people could possess. When the attendant glanced at it, her face froze, her confidence shattering. Something was happening. But what? The card in his hand was unlike any the attendant had seen before. Her fingers hesitated, unsure whether to take it, yet curiosity gnawed at her. The man watched her struggle, his expression unreadable. A moment of silence passed between them, the tension thick in the air. The other passengers, many of whom had been watching the scene unfold, began to shift in their seats, the quiet hum of the plane now feeling strangely ominous. In the back of the cabin, a few passengers exchanged looks, wondering why the flight attendant had become so suddenly flustered. Some murmured that he looked like someone important, but others dismissed the idea, convinced that the woman was just doing her job. Meanwhile, the man remained calm, his steady gaze never leaving her face. The attendant's mind raced. She had seen VIP passengers before, businessmen, celebrities, but this felt different. She'd never been challenged like this in her years of service. The hesitation was unsettling. Could he truly be someone of importance, or was he just playing some elaborate game? She cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. "I'm sorry, sir, but you'll need to move," she repeated, the firmness in her voice masking her doubt. Yet, the unease lingered in her eyes. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he casually tucked the card back into his pocket, then slowly stood up, his calm presence almost mocking the situation. He wasn't angry, but there was an undeniable sense of authority about him. As he moved toward the front of the cabin, the murmurs only grew louder, more frequent. What was he doing? Was he making a scene for attention? Or was there more to this than anyone could see? Suddenly, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through the growing whispers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to remind you that this is a private flight. Please remain seated until we reach cruising altitude. Thank you." The words were polite, but the underlying message was clear. This wasn't a typical commercial flight. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. What was that about? The realization began to dawn on her. She might have made a huge mistake. The captain's announcement only deepened the uncertainty in the cabin. The murmurs grew louder as passengers looked at each other confused. The man, now halfway down the aisle, didn't break stride. His slow, deliberate movements were like a ticking clock, each second counting down to something the flight attendant couldn't yet understand. She stood frozen, staring at the door he was headed toward. Her mind raced, but no answers came. Behind her, a group of passengers began to stir, their interest piqued. One woman, who had been watching from the back, turned to her neighbor. "Did you hear that? Private flight," she whispered. "I thought this was a regular flight." The attendant tried to shake off the unease gnawing at her gut. She quickly walked over to the galley phone and pressed the button, her fingers trembling slightly as she spoke to the cockpit. "Captain, we need to address something with a passenger up front. He's not supposed to be there." The line went dead silent for a moment. Then the captain's voice came back, calm, but with an edge of something she couldn't quite place. "He's supposed to be there. You don't need to do anything." Her stomach dropped. Her legs felt weak beneath her head spinning. What did that mean? Why had he been allowed in the first-class cabin when no one else had? Was he a special guest? Was he someone who had purchased the entire section? She glanced around the cabin, her eyes scanning the faces of the passengers. They seemed more aware now, more tense. Was she the only one who hadn't figured it out yet? The man, now at the front, paused in front of the cockpit door. His hand hovered for a moment over the handle, but before he could enter, the door slid open. A flight crew member stepped out, giving him a respectful nod, one that spoke volumes. "Mr. Wright, welcome aboard." The attendant's heart stopped. "Mr. Wright," she whispered to herself, not quite believing her ears. The realization hit her like a freight train. This man wasn't just some ordinary passenger. The name was familiar. She had heard it, read it in the news even. He was one of the wealthiest private jet owners in the world. But how could she have been so blind? How could she have thought he was just another passenger? Her breath caught in her throat. The tension in the cabin was palpable now, thick with anticipation. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, waiting for her next move, but she was paralyzed. The consequences of her actions hung in the air like a storm cloud, and she knew that what happened next could change everything. The words "Mr. Wright" echoed in the flight attendant's mind, and for a split second she forgot to breathe. But just as she began to process the shocking reality, the door to the cockpit swung open again, and a different voice, a sharp, authoritative voice, came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently rerouting to a new destination. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The sudden announcement caught everyone off guard. The air in the cabin thickened with confusion. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances, some beginning to whisper among themselves, others looking nervously toward the front of the plane. But the flight attendant didn't have the luxury of reacting just yet. The man, Mr. Wright, was now seated in a private compartment near the front, talking quietly with a member of the crew. Her mind was racing. Why the sudden change of course? Why hadn't the captain given a reason for the reroute? She could hear murmurs of speculation swirling around her, passengers anxiously glancing at the clock, wondering where they were headed. But one thing was certain, this was no longer just a misunderstanding over seating. The tension escalated when another figure appeared at the front of the cabin, a tall, sharply dressed man in his late 40s, wearing dark sunglasses. He moved with purpose, scanning the room like he was looking for someone. The flight attendant's eyes locked on him, and her stomach tightened. He wasn't part of the crew, and his presence was entirely unexpected. His gaze swept across the cabin, and he briefly made eye contact with her before his attention shifted to Mr. Wright. The air grew colder, and the murmurs from the passengers grew louder. They weren't sure who this man was, but they knew something wasn't right. The flight attendant felt an unease creep into her bones. Her instincts told her this wasn't just an ordinary business flight. There was something much bigger at play, and she had only begun to realize the layers of it. As the mystery man approached Mr. Wright, their conversation was low, but their body language spoke volumes. The brief exchange seemed almost rehearsed, like a carefully staged meeting. Her heart raced as she realized that this was no longer just about a simple seating mix-up. The stakes had skyrocketed. What had she gotten herself into? And why was the plane suddenly rerouting? Something was happening, and she was at the very center of it, standing at the edge of a story she couldn't yet comprehend. As the mysterious man reached Mr. Wright, the flight attendant watched them exchange a brief, almost imperceptible nod. She couldn't help but feel like she was witnessing something bigger than herself, something that had been unfolding well before this flight. The tension was palpable as the crew members, who had been silent up to this point, began moving with a purpose. The plane was no longer just an aircraft. It was now a part of a much larger, high-stakes operation.